Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight, we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you, like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. This isn't some fairy tale or Hollywood fantasy. This is the true story of Roxolana, a woman whose very existence shattered every expectation of what was possible in the 16th century Ottoman Empire. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how she accomplished the impossible and why her story still matters today. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Roxolana didn't just influence one sultan. She didn't just survive in the cutthroat world of the Ottoman court. She completely revolutionized how power worked in one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. And she did it all while breaking rules that had stood for over 200 years. My name is Sarah, and I've spent years studying the most fascinating women in history. These are the stories of women who refused to accept the limitations placed on them by their time period. And trust me, after you hear Roxolana's story, you'll never look at power the same way again. Now, to understand just how extraordinary Roxolana's rise truly was, we need to step back into the world of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1500s. Picture this, an empire that stretched across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Black Sea to North Africa. This wasn't just any kingdom. This was a superpower that made European monarchs tremble. At the heart of this empire sat the Sultan, the ultimate ruler whose word was law. And surrounding him was a world most of us can barely imagine. The Ottoman court wasn't like European royal courts. It operated on completely different principles, with different rules, different hierarchies, and different paths to power. For women, these paths were incredibly limited. The most powerful women in the empire were mothers of princes, and even they had to navigate a system designed to keep them in the shadows. But here's where things get interesting. Within this rigid system, there was one place where a woman could potentially gain influence, the imperial harem. Now, forget everything you think you know about harems from movies or popular culture. The Ottoman imperial harem wasn't some pleasure palace filled with dancing girls. It was actually one of the most sophisticated political institutions in the empire. Think of it as a combination of finishing school, political training ground, and the ultimate ladder to power, all rolled into one. The harem housed hundreds of women, but they weren't all there for the same reasons. Many were slaves, captured during military campaigns, or purchased from markets across the empire. Others were gifts from provincial governors seeking to curry favor with the Sultan. But regardless of how they arrived, once inside those walls, they entered a world with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own brutal competition. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the newest arrivals, young women who had to learn everything from scratch. The Ottoman language, Islamic customs, court etiquette, music, poetry, embroidery. They were essentially being transformed from whoever they had been before into potential companions for the most powerful man in the empire. But here's the crucial part. Most of these women would never even meet the Sultan. They would spend their entire lives in the harem, serving those above them in the hierarchy, hoping for a chance that might never come. The few who did catch the Sultan's attention faced even more challenges, because in the Ottoman system, there was one rule that had never been broken. The Sultan could have many consorts, but he could only have one legal wife. And that wife was always a Muslim noblewoman, never a slave. This system had worked for generations. It kept power distributed among different families, prevented any one woman from gaining too much influence, and maintained the delicate balance that held the empire together. The mothers of princes could gain some power, but their influence was always temporary, always dependent on their sons' success, and always limited by their status as former slaves. Into this world, sometime around 1520, came a young woman, whose real name we don't even know for certain. History remembers her as Roxolana, though that name itself tells a story. It means the Russian woman, suggesting she came from the lands of Ruthenia, in what is now Ukraine. But her original name, her family, her childhood, all of that was stripped away the moment she was captured and sold into slavery. Imagine being torn from everything you've ever known. Your family, your language, your customs, your very identity, all gone in an instant. You're marched hundreds of miles to a foreign land, sold in a marketplace like a piece of property, and then thrust into a world where you understand nothing and no one. But Roxolana was different. From the very beginning, something set her apart from the other young women who arrived at the imperial harem around the same time. It wasn't just her striking red hair, though that certainly made her memorable in a world where most women had dark features. It wasn't just her intelligence, though she was clearly brilliant. It was something harder to define, something that would only become clear as her story unfolded. The early years in the harem were crucial. This was where futures were made or destroyed, where young women either learned to navigate the complex web of relationships and rivalries, or they disappeared into obscurity forever. Roxolana threw herself into this world with a determination that impressed even her instructors. She mastered Ottoman Turkish with remarkable speed. She learned to read and write, skills that many women of her time, even noble women, never acquired. She studied Islamic law and theology, understanding that knowledge was power in this deeply religious empire. She learned music and poetry, arts that could help her stand out in a crowd of beautiful faces. But most importantly, she learned to observe. She watched how power moved through the harem. She studied the women who had influence and those who didn't. She began to understand that survival in this world required more than just beauty or intelligence. It required strategy. The harem had its own internal politics, as complex and dangerous as any royal court. There were alliances and betrayals, friendships, and bitter rivalries. The older women, those who had been there for years, guarded their positions jealously. They had seen countless young women arrive with dreams of catching the Sultan's eye, only to fade into the background when newer, younger faces appeared. For most of these women, the ultimate goal was simple: gain the Sultan's favor, bear him a son, and hope that son might one day inherit the throne. It was a long shot, but it was the only path to real power available to them. The mothers of princes held special status in the harem. They were given their own apartments, their own servants, their own income. If their son became sultan, they could become the most powerful woman in the empire. But even this path had its limitations. A mother's power was always dependent on her son. If he died young, if he fell out of favor, if another prince proved more capable, she could lose everything overnight. And throughout all of this, she remained what she had always been: a former slave, never able to marry the sultan, never able to claim the ultimate prize of becoming his legal wife and empress. This was the world Roxolana entered, and these were the rules she was expected to follow. But as she observed and learned, as she grew more confident in her understanding of how this system worked, she began to see something that others had missed. She began to see not just how things were, but how they could be different. The Sultan at this time was Suleiman, later known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. He had recently ascended to the throne, young, ambitious, and already showing signs of the greatness that would define his reign. He was expanding the empire, leading military campaigns that struck fear into the hearts of European rulers, and transforming Constantinople into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. When Suleiman first noticed the red-haired woman from Ruthenia, it seemed like just another typical attraction between a sultan and one of his concubines. She was beautiful, intelligent, and charming. She could make him laugh with her wit and engage him in conversation about poetry and philosophy. In a world where the Sultan was surrounded by people who told him only what they thought he wanted to hear, Roxolana offered something different, genuine companionship. But what started as attraction slowly began to transform into something unprecedented in Ottoman history. Suleiman wasn't just drawn to Roxolana physically. He began to value her opinions, to seek her counsel, to include her in conversations about matters of state. This was dangerous territory. Sultans were expected to maintain emotional distance from their concubines, to treat them as interchangeable pleasures rather than true partners. As months turned into years, something even more extraordinary happened. Suleiman began to neglect his other concubines, in a system designed around the principle that the Sultan would father children with multiple women to ensure the succession and maintain balance among different factions. He was focusing his attention on just one woman. The harem began to whisper. The court officials grew concerned. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. A sultan who became too attached to one woman upset the delicate balance that kept the empire stable. But Suleiman seemed oblivious to these concerns, or perhaps he simply didn't care. And Roxolana, she was playing a game no woman had ever dared to play before. She wasn't just trying to bear the Sultan a son and hope for the best. She wasn't content to accept the limitations that had constrained every woman before her. She was systematically, carefully, brilliantly positioning herself for something that everyone believed was impossible. The first sign that something unprecedented was happening came when Roxolana gave birth to her first son, Mehmed, in 1521. In the normal course of events, this should have secured her position as one of the Sultan's favoured concubines, but nothing more. She would raise her son, hope he proved capable, and compete with the other mothers of princes for influence. But Roxolana had different plans. Instead of accepting the traditional role of a prince's mother, she began to consolidate her influence in ways that shocked the Ottoman establishment. She didn't just focus on her son's education and training. She began to involve herself in court politics, to build relationships with powerful officials, to position herself not just as a mother, but as a political force in her own right. This was revolutionary behavior that went against everything the Ottoman court understood about how power worked. But Roxolana wasn't finished. She was just getting started. What made her approach so brilliant was that she understood something fundamental about power that most people miss entirely. Power isn't just about titles or official positions. Real power comes from becoming indispensable to the person who holds ultimate authority. And that's exactly what Roxolana set out to do. While other concubines focused on their beauty, their charm, their ability to please the Sultan in traditional ways, Roxolana made herself useful in ways no woman had ever attempted before. She began to serve as Suleiman's confidant, his advisor, his closest companion. When he faced difficult decisions about military campaigns, she offered insights. When he dealt with rebellious governors, she provided counsel. When he struggled with the complexities of ruling such a vast empire, she became his sounding board. This wasn't just pillow talk or casual conversation. Roxolana was inserting herself into the actual business of running the Ottoman Empire. And the most shocking part, Suleiman was letting her do it. More than that, he was actively seeking her input. But here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. In 1526, something happened that sent shockwaves through the entire Ottoman establishment. Roxolana gave birth to another son, Selim. Under normal circumstances, this would have been cause for celebration. Another prince meant another potential heir, another source of strength for the dynasty, but the reaction from the court was anything but celebratory. You see, by this point Suleiman had been ignoring his other concubines for years. He wasn't just favouring Roxolana, he was treating her like she was his only woman. And now she had given him 2 sons, while other women in the harem remained childless and forgotten. This created a crisis that went to the very heart of how the Ottoman Empire operated. The system depended on balance. Multiple mothers, multiple sons, competition between different factions. It prevented any one family line from gaining too much power and ensured that the strongest, most capable prince would eventually rise to the top. But Suleiman's obsession with Roxolana was destroying that balance. Court officials began to panic. They whispered in corners about the dangerous precedent being set. They worried about what would happen to the empire if the Sultan continued down this path. And then, in 1528, Roxolana did something that proved she wasn't just lucky or beautiful or charming. She did something that demonstrated a level of political sophistication that rivaled the most experienced statesman in the empire. She gave birth to a 3rd son, Bayezid. 3 sons, 3 potential heirs, all from the same mother. This was unprecedented in Ottoman history. But Roxolana wasn't content with just producing heirs. She was already thinking several moves ahead, already planning for a future that no one else could even imagine. While the court buzzed with concern and confusion, Roxolana quietly began to build what can only be described as a political machine. She cultivated relationships with key officials. She placed allies in crucial positions throughout the palace. She created a network of supporters who owed their advancement to her influence. Most importantly, she began to position herself as more than just the mother of princes. She started to present herself as Suleiman's true partner, his equal in all but official title. And here's the truly remarkable part. She was succeeding. By the early 1530s, Roxolana's influence had grown to the point where foreign ambassadors were reporting back to their governments that this former slave girl had become one of the most powerful people in the Ottoman Empire. Venetian diplomats wrote detailed reports about her involvement in state affairs. European courts began to factor her opinions into their diplomatic calculations. But the Ottoman establishment still believed they understood the rules of the game. Yes, Roxolana had gained unusual influence. Yes, she had produced multiple sons for the Sultan. Yes, she had inserted herself into political affairs in ways that were unprecedented for a concubine. But at the end of the day, she was still just a concubine. She was still just a former slave. There were still limits to how far she could rise. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The turning point came in 1533, and it involved a scandal that rocked the empire to its very foundations. Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa, was born to another concubine named Mahidevran before Roxolana had even arrived at court. As the firstborn prince, Mustafa was widely expected to inherit the throne. He was talented, charismatic, and popular with both the military and the common people. But Mustafa represented everything that threatened Roxolana's position. If he became sultan, her own sons would likely be eliminated according to Ottoman tradition. The new sultan typically had his brothers executed to prevent civil wars and succession disputes. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a brutal but effective way of maintaining stability in an empire that stretched across 3 continents. So when rumors began to circulate that Mustafa was becoming too ambitious, too eager to claim power while his father was still alive, Roxolana saw an opportunity. But what she did next revealed the full extent of her political genius and her utter ruthlessness. Instead of directly attacking Mustafa, which would have been obvious and potentially dangerous, Roxolana began a campaign of subtle manipulation that would make Machiavelli proud. She didn't spread rumors herself. Instead, she created situations where others would spread rumors for her. She didn't make accusations directly. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt that grew into suspicions in other people's minds. The details of exactly how she orchestrated Mustafa's downfall are still debated by historians. but the results were undeniable. By 1536, Suleiman had become convinced that his eldest son was plotting against him. The young prince, who had once been the clear heir to the throne, was now viewed with suspicion and distrust. But even as she was eliminating threats to her son's future, Roxolana was planning something that would shock the world, something that would break every rule, overturn every tradition, and change the course of Ottoman history forever. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them. Roxolana had stopped referring to herself by her slave name. She had begun signing letters and documents with new titles that suggested a status no concubine had ever claimed. She had started appearing at official ceremonies in ways that suggested she was more than just another member of the harem, and then came the announcement that changed everything. In 1534, word spread through the palace like wildfire. Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, commander of the faithful, shadow of God on earth, had done something that no Ottoman sultan had ever done before. He had married his concubine, not just any marriage, not a secret ceremony or a private exchange of vows. This was an official, public, legally binding marriage that elevated Roxolana from slave to empress, from concubine to wife, from powerless outsider to the second most powerful person in the empire. The shockwaves were immediate and devastating. Court officials who had spent their entire careers navigating the established rules of Ottoman politics suddenly found themselves in uncharted territory. Foreign diplomats scrambled to understand what this meant for their relationships with the empire. The entire social order that had governed the Ottoman world for centuries had just been turned upside down. But perhaps the most shocked person of all was Mahidevran, the mother of Prince Mustafa. For years, she had been the senior concubine, the mother of the heir apparent, the woman who seemed destined to become the most powerful woman in the empire when her son took the throne. Now, suddenly, she found herself outranked by a woman who had started as a mere slave. The transformation was complete, but Roxolana's story was far from over. In fact, the most dramatic chapters were still to come, because becoming empress was just the beginning of what she had planned. Now that she had official status, now that she was legally married to the sultan, now that she had broken the ultimate barrier that had constrained every woman before her, Roxolana could begin to implement the rest of her vision. And what she did next would prove that her ambitions extended far beyond personal advancement. She was about to reshape the very nature of power in the Ottoman Empire, to create a new model of female authority that would influence the course of history for generations to come. The slave girl from Ruthenia had become an empress, but that was just the first step in a plan that would make her one of the most influential women who ever lived. The marriage ceremony itself was a spectacle unlike anything the Ottoman court had ever witnessed. Traditionally, sultans married in private affairs, often for political alliances with other royal families. But Suleiman's marriage to Roxolana was a public declaration, a statement that this union represented something entirely new in Ottoman history. The ceremony combined Ottoman traditions with innovations that reflected Roxolana's unique position. She wore robes of gold and purple, colours reserved for the highest ranks of imperial authority. The wedding feast lasted for days, with celebrations that rivaled those held for military victories. Foreign ambassadors were invited to witness the event, sending the message across Europe and beyond that this marriage was to be taken seriously by the international community. But beyond the pageantry and symbolism, the marriage had immediate practical consequences that rippled through every level of Ottoman society. Overnight, Roxolana's status changed from that of a favoured concubine to that of an official partner in ruling the empire. Her apartments in the palace were expanded and redecorated to reflect her new rank. Her personal staff was increased, and she was assigned her own treasury and administrative apparatus. Most significantly, her son's positions in the line of succession were now unquestionably secure. As the legitimate children of the Sultan's legal wife, they held advantages that no other princes could claim. this wasn't just about titles and ceremonies. In the brutal world of Ottoman succession politics, legitimacy could mean the difference between inheriting an empire and losing one's life. The reaction from the traditional Ottoman elite was swift and brutal. These were men whose families had served sultans for generations, who understood power through the lens of established precedent, who believed that certain boundaries simply could not be crossed. To them, Suleiman's marriage to Roxolana wasn't just unprecedented, it was dangerous. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, who had been Suleiman's closest friend and advisor since childhood, found himself in an impossible position. He had watched Roxolana's rise with growing concern, understanding better than most what her influence meant for the traditional power structures of the empire. Now, with her elevation to Empress, he faced a rival whose authority came directly from the Sultan himself. Ibrahim had built his career on being Suleiman's most trusted confidant, the man who translated the Sultan's will into action across the vast empire. But Roxolana's new position threatened that special relationship. She now had official standing to offer counsel, to influence decisions, to shape policy in ways that no woman had ever been permitted to do. The tension between Ibrahim and Roxolana became one of the defining political dramas of the 1530s. On the surface, both maintained the elaborate courtesies required by Ottoman protocol. But beneath the formal politeness, a deadly serious struggle was taking place for influence over the Sultan's mind and heart. Ibrahim represented the old way of doing things. He was a product of the Devshirme system, taken as a child from his Christian family, converted to Islam, and raised to serve the Ottoman state with absolute loyalty. He understood empire through military conquest, administrative efficiency, and the careful balance of competing interests that had made Ottoman rule so successful. Roxolana represented something entirely different. She brought a perspective shaped by her experience as an outsider, someone who had seen the empire's power from the bottom up, rather than from within its established hierarchies. Her approach to problems was often more creative, more willing to break with tradition when tradition seemed inadequate to meet new challenges. The conflict came to a head in 1536, when Ibrahim made a fatal miscalculation. Perhaps believing that his long friendship with Suleiman made his position unassailable, perhaps underestimating Roxolana's political skills, he began to openly question some of her influences on imperial policy. He suggested, not entirely subtly, that a sultan should not allow a woman, even his wife, to interfere in matters of state. What Ibrahim failed to understand was that Roxolana had spent years studying how power really worked in the Ottoman system. She knew that direct confrontation was rarely the most effective approach. Instead of arguing with Ibrahim publicly or complaining to Suleiman about his Grand Vizier's attitudes, she did something far more sophisticated. She began to demonstrate her value in ways that made Ibrahim's criticism seem not just wrong, but dangerous to the empire's interests. When diplomatic correspondence arrived from European courts, she helped Suleiman understand the subtle implications that might escape a purely military mind. When reports came in from distant provinces, she offered insights into local conditions that proved remarkably accurate. When complex trade disputes arose, she suggested solutions that satisfied multiple parties while strengthening Ottoman authority. Slowly, methodically, Roxolana made herself indispensable to the actual work of governing the empire. And as she did so, Ibrahim's position began to look less secure. The Grand Vizier, who had once seemed irreplaceable, started to appear like a relic of an earlier era, a man whose understanding of power was too limited for the challenges facing the empire. The end came suddenly. In March 1536, Ibrahim Pasha was found dead in his palace chambers. Officially, he had died in his sleep. Unofficially, everyone understood that he had been executed on Suleiman's orders. The man who had been the Sultan's closest friend, his most trusted advisor, his partner in conquering vast territories and building a magnificent empire, had fallen from grace so completely that he didn't even receive a trial. The message was clear to everyone in the Ottoman court. The old rules no longer applied. The traditional sources of power and influence had been fundamentally altered. And at the center of this transformation stood Roxolana, the former slave who had just eliminated the most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan himself. But removing Ibrahim was only one part of Roxolana's larger strategy. With the Grand Vizier gone, she moved quickly to consolidate her influence over the imperial administration. She didn't seek official titles for herself. That would have been too radical, even for someone who had already broken so many precedents. Instead, she worked through a network of allies and protégés, men who owed their advancement to her support and who understood that their continued success depended on maintaining her favor. This was political genius of the highest order. By working through others rather than claiming direct authority, Roxolana avoided the appearance of overstepping traditional boundaries while actually expanding her real power far beyond what any woman had ever wielded in Ottoman history. She became the invisible hand that guided imperial policy, the voice that whispered in the Sultan's ear, the mind that shaped decisions affecting millions of people across 3 continents. Her influence extended into every aspect of imperial governance. When new governors were appointed to distant provinces, her opinion carried weight in the selection process. When trade agreements were negotiated with foreign merchants, her insights helped shape the terms. When military campaigns were planned, her strategic thinking contributed to the overall approach. But perhaps most importantly, Roxolana began to use her position to advance a broader vision of what the Ottoman Empire could become. She understood that the empire's greatest strength lay not just in its military might, but in its ability to incorporate diverse peoples and cultures into a unified whole. Her own rise from captured slave to empress embodied this principle, and she worked to extend similar opportunities to others. She became a patron of architecture, commissioning mosques, hospitals, and schools that served communities throughout the empire. These weren't just acts of piety or charity. They were strategic investments in the empire's social fabric, ways of strengthening the bonds between ruler and ruled that made Ottoman authority more stable and more legitimate. Her most ambitious architectural project was a magnificent mosque complex in Constantinople that bore her name. The Haseki Sultan Mosque wasn't just a place of worship, it was a statement about her permanent place in Ottoman history, a declaration that her influence would outlast her own lifetime. But even as she consolidated her power and implemented her vision for the empire, Roxolana never forgot the ultimate goal that had driven her from the beginning, securing the succession for her sons. The elimination of Ibrahim Pasha had removed one obstacle, but the greatest threat to her children's future remained Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by another woman. Mustafa had grown into everything a future sultan should be. He was intelligent, charismatic, and popular with the military. He had proven himself in battle, demonstrated skill in administration, and earned respect from both Ottoman elites and common people. In any normal succession, he would have been the obvious choice to inherit the throne, but these weren't normal circumstances. Mustafa represented not just a threat to Roxolana's sons, but a challenge to everything she had built. If he became sultan, he would likely return to traditional ways of governing, rolling back the innovations and changes that had elevated women's influence in the imperial system. More immediately, Ottoman tradition dictated that when a new sultan took power, he would eliminate potential rivals by having his brothers executed. This wasn't personal cruelty. It was seen as a necessary measure to prevent civil wars that could tear the empire apart. But it meant that if Mustafa inherited the throne, Roxolana's sons would face certain death. So Roxolana began to plan the most dangerous and delicate operation of her career. She needed to eliminate Mustafa without appearing to be behind his downfall. She needed to convince Suleiman that his eldest son posed a threat to imperial stability, and she needed to do it all while maintaining her image as a loyal wife and devoted mother. The campaign against Mustafa unfolded over several years, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that demonstrated Roxolana's complete mastery of Ottoman court politics. She didn't spread rumors herself. That would have been too obvious and potentially dangerous. Instead, she created situations where others would draw the conclusions she wanted them to reach. She arranged for certain information to reach Suleiman at particular moments, always through intermediaries who had no apparent connection to her. She ensured that reports of Mustafa's popularity with the military were presented in ways that emphasized potential disloyalty rather than admirable leadership. She helped shape the Sultan's interpretation of his son's actions, turning signs of capability into evidence of dangerous ambition. The psychological pressure on Suleiman must have been enormous. On one hand, he loved his eldest son and had groomed him for leadership. On the other hand, Ottoman history was filled with examples of princes who had rebelled against their fathers, causing devastating civil wars that weakened the empire for generations. Roxolana understood this internal conflict and exploited it with surgical precision. She never directly accused Mustafa of treachery. Instead, she expressed concern for Suleiman's safety, worry about the empire's stability, fear that enemies might try to manipulate the prince's legitimate ambitions for their own purposes. By 1553, the psychological campaign had achieved its desired effect. Suleiman had become convinced that Mustafa posed a genuine threat to his authority and to the empire's security. The decision, when it came, was swift and brutal. During a military campaign, Suleiman summoned his eldest son to his tent and had him strangled by deaf-mute executioners. The execution of Mustafa sent shockwaves throughout the empire. He had been widely seen as the most capable of Suleiman's sons, the prince most likely to maintain Ottoman greatness into the next generation. His death eliminated the most obvious heir and left the succession wide open. But for Roxolana, Mustafa's elimination was both a triumph and the beginning of a new challenge. With the greatest threat to her sons removed, she now had to ensure that one of them would actually inherit the throne. This meant navigating the complex dynamics between her remaining children and positioning the right son to succeed his father. Her eldest son, Mehmed, had been the obvious choice. He was intelligent, well-educated, and had shown promise in administrative roles. But in 1543, tragedy struck when Mehmed died suddenly, probably from illness. The loss was devastating for Roxolana personally, and created new uncertainty about the succession. This left her with two surviving sons, Selim and Bayezid. Both were capable, but they represented very different approaches to leadership and very different visions for the empire's future. Selim was more traditional in his outlook, focused on maintaining established practices and avoiding unnecessary risks. Bayezid was more innovative, more willing to experiment with new ideas and approaches. Under normal circumstances, the two brothers might have competed for their father's favor in relatively peaceful ways, allowing Suleiman to choose his successor based on demonstrated merit. But the elimination of Mustafa had created a precedent that made such peaceful competition impossible. Both Selim and Bayezid understood that only one of them would survive to become sultan. The rivalry between Roxolana's surviving sons became the defining political drama of the 1550s. Both brothers built their own networks of supporters, developed their own approaches to key issues, and sought to position themselves as the most worthy heir to their father's throne. Roxolana found herself in an impossible position. As a mother, she loved both sons equally and wanted them both to succeed. As a political strategist, she understood that only one could survive, and that her choice would determine not just the empire's future leadership, but the fate of her family line. The competition between Selim and Bayezid played out across the empire, with each brother serving as governor of different provinces and demonstrating their capabilities in real-world situations. Bayezid proved himself an effective military commander and a capable administrator, earning respect from soldiers and civilians alike. Selim showed different strengths, particularly in diplomatic and cultural affairs. But as the rivalry intensified, it became clear that Bayezid was emerging as the more popular choice among many Ottoman elites and military commanders. His energy, charisma, and innovative thinking reminded many people of Suleiman himself in his younger years. If popular support had been the deciding factor, Bayezid might well have been chosen as the next sultan. However, Roxolana understood something that her younger son did not. Popular support could be dangerous as well as beneficial. A prince who was too popular, too independent, too willing to challenge established authority might be seen as a threat even by his own father. The fate of Mustafa served as a constant reminder of what could happen to sons who appeared too ambitious. Selim, by contrast, represented stability and continuity. He was capable without being threatening, competent without being revolutionary. From Suleiman's perspective, he might have seemed like a safer choice for maintaining imperial unity and avoiding the kind of succession crisis that had destroyed other empires. The final confrontation between the two brothers came in 1559, when their rivalry erupted into open civil war. Bayezid, perhaps sensing that his father was leaning towards Selim, decided to force the issue by rebelling against imperial authority. It was a desperate gamble that ultimately proved fatal. Suleiman sided with Selim, providing him with military support to crush his brother's rebellion. Bayezid fled to Persia seeking refuge, but even there, he wasn't safe. Through diplomatic pressure and probably bribery, Suleiman arranged for his younger son to be executed by Persian authorities in 1561. The death of Bayezid left Selim as the sole surviving heir, ensuring his succession when Suleiman died in 1566. But it also marked the end of Roxolana's direct involvement in Ottoman politics. She had died in 1558, just 1 year before the final confrontation between her sons, missing the resolution of the succession crisis that had defined the last decades of her life. Yet even in death, Roxolana's influence continued to shape the empire she had helped transform. The precedents she had established, the changes she had implemented, the new model of female authority she had created, all of these would outlast her own lifetime and continue to influence Ottoman politics for generations to come. Her death marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in Ottoman history. The empire that Selim inherited was fundamentally different from the one that had existed when his mother first arrived as a young slave. Power worked differently, women's roles had expanded, and the very nature of imperial authority had been transformed. The transformation wasn't just about one remarkable woman's rise to power. It represented a broader evolution in how the Ottoman Empire understood itself and its place in the world. Roxolana had proven that talent and intelligence could triumph over birth and tradition, that outsiders could become insiders, that the empire's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt and change. But her story also revealed the costs of such dramatic transformation. The elimination of Mustafa and Bayezid, the destruction of Ibrahim Pasha, the upheaval of traditional power structures, all of these came with human consequences that were both tragic and profound. Looking back at Roxolana's extraordinary journey, it becomes clear that her impact extended far beyond the immediate political changes she engineered. The woman who had arrived as a nameless slave had fundamentally altered the DNA of one of history's most powerful empires. But understanding the full scope of her legacy requires examining not just what she accomplished, but how she accomplished it, and what it meant for the countless people whose lives were touched by her influence. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from Roxolana's era was a dramatically different entity from the one she had entered decades earlier. The rigid hierarchies that had once seemed unbreakable had been proven flexible. The assumption that certain positions of power were permanently closed to certain types of people had been shattered. The very concept of who could wield influence and how they could use it had been revolutionized. Consider the ripple effects of her architectural patronage alone. When Roxolana commissioned the construction of mosques, hospitals and schools throughout the empire, she wasn't just engaging in charitable work or religious devotion. She was creating a physical legacy that would serve communities for centuries, while simultaneously establishing a model for how powerful women could use their resources to shape society. Her Haseki Sultan Mosque in Constantinople became more than just a place of worship. It served as a symbol of female authority, a reminder to future generations that women could leave permanent marks on the empire's landscape. The hospital she built provided medical care to thousands of people who might otherwise have gone without treatment. The schools she funded educated children whose families could never have afforded such opportunities. But perhaps more significantly, these projects established precedents that other powerful women would follow. Roxolana had created a template for how female influence could be channeled into lasting social benefits. The wives and mothers of future sultans would look to her example when seeking ways to use their positions for public good. The diplomatic sphere also felt Roxolana's lasting influence. Her correspondence with foreign rulers had broken new ground in international relations. When she exchanged letters with Catherine de' Medici of France, or engaged in diplomatic communications with Polish nobles, she was establishing the principle that Ottoman women could serve as legitimate representatives of imperial authority in dealings with other powers. These weren't casual social exchanges between royal ladies. Roxolana's letters dealt with matters of trade, military alliances, and territorial disputes. European courts began to understand that ignoring the Ottoman Empress meant potentially missing crucial information about imperial policy and decision-making. Her diplomatic activities also created new channels of communication that proved valuable during times of crisis. When military conflicts arose between the Ottoman Empire and European powers, the relationships Roxolana had built provided alternative paths for negotiation and conflict resolution. Her network of international contacts became a resource that successive generations of Ottoman leaders could draw upon. The transformation of the imperial harem itself represented another crucial aspect of Roxolana's legacy. The institution she had encountered as a young woman had been primarily focused on producing heirs and providing companionship for the Sultan. Under her influence, it evolved into something resembling a center of political education and cultural refinement. Women entering the harem during and after Roxolana's era found expanded opportunities for intellectual development. The emphasis on literacy, language skills, and cultural knowledge that she had promoted created a generation of remarkably educated women who could contribute meaningfully to imperial governance, even if they never achieved her level of direct political influence. The harem's role as a training ground for future administrators and diplomats became more pronounced. Young women learned not just traditional feminine arts, but also statecraft, economics, and international relations. Some would go on to serve as advisors to provincial governors. Others would manage vast estates and commercial enterprises. Still, others would serve as informal ambassadors, using their cultural connections to facilitate trade and diplomatic relations. This evolution had profound implications for Ottoman society as a whole. When educated, capable women were given meaningful roles in governance and administration. The empire gained access to a vast reservoir of human talent that had previously been underutilized. The economic and administrative benefits of this change would compound over generations. The legal precedents established by Roxolana's marriage also created new possibilities for future generations of Ottoman women. While few would achieve her level of influence, the principle that a sultan could legally marry a woman regardless of her origins opened doors that had previously been sealed shut. Subsequent sultans would occasionally follow Suleiman's example, elevating favored concubines to the status of legal wives. While none of these women would match Roxolana's political achievements, their elevated status provided them with security and influence that would have been impossible under the old system. More broadly, Roxolana's rise demonstrated that social mobility within the Ottoman system was more flexible than many had assumed. Her transformation from slave to empress provided inspiration and practical proof that dramatic advancement was possible for those with sufficient intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. This message resonated throughout Ottoman society, encouraging ambition and innovation among people who might otherwise have accepted limited prospects. The empire's famous meritocratic tendencies, which had always existed to some degree, became more pronounced as Roxolana's example showed just how far talent could take someone regardless of their origins. The cultural impact of her story extended even beyond the Ottoman Empire's borders. European observers who had initially dismissed her as merely another royal mistress gradually came to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of female power. Her story became a subject of fascination in courts across Europe, inspiring both admiration and concern. Some European noblewomen looked to Roxolana's example as proof that women could wield significant political influence when given the opportunity. They began to push for expanded roles in their own societies, citing the Ottoman Empress as evidence that female governance could be both effective and beneficial. Others, particularly male courtiers and administrators, viewed her rise with alarm. If a former slave could achieve such power in the Ottoman system, what did that suggest about the stability of traditional hierarchies elsewhere? Roxolana's success forced European elites to confront uncomfortable questions about their own assumptions regarding gender, class, and political authority. The religious dimensions of her influence also had lasting consequences. As a Christian who had converted to Islam, Roxolana embodied the Ottoman Empire's complex relationship with religious diversity. Her success demonstrated that conversion could lead to full integration into Ottoman society, even at its highest levels. This example encouraged other converts to pursue advancement within the imperial system. It also reinforced the empire's appeal to talented individuals from diverse backgrounds who might find opportunities in Ottoman service that were unavailable in their societies of origin. At the same time, Roxolana's patronage of Islamic institutions and her visible piety helped legitimize her authority among traditional Muslims who might otherwise have questioned the appropriateness of such extensive female influence. By demonstrating her commitment to Islamic values and practices, she made her political activities more acceptable to conservative elements within Ottoman society. The educational initiatives she supported also had far-reaching effects. The schools she funded didn't just serve immediate communities. They became models for educational institutions throughout the empire. Her emphasis on combining traditional Islamic learning with practical skills created a template that influenced Ottoman educational policy for generations. Students who benefited from these educational opportunities went on to serve in various capacities throughout the empire. Some became religious scholars and judges. Others pursued careers in trade and commerce. Still others entered imperial service as administrators and diplomats. The network of educated individuals created by Roxolana's educational patronage contributed to the empire's administrative capacity and cultural vitality for decades after her death. The economic implications of her influence were equally significant. Roxolana's involvement in trade policy and commercial regulation helped shape an economic environment that encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. Her understanding of international markets and trade relationships contributed to policies that strengthened the Ottoman economy during a crucial period of global expansion. The commercial networks she helped establish or support created lasting trading relationships that benefited Ottoman merchants and craftsmen for generations. Her diplomatic correspondence often dealt with trade disputes and commercial agreements, and her insights helped resolve conflicts that might otherwise have disrupted profitable economic relationships. The workshops and manufacturing facilities that operated under her patronage also established precedents for female involvement in economic activities. Women who observed her example began to pursue their own commercial ventures, contributing to a gradual expansion of female economic participation that strengthened the empire's overall prosperity. Perhaps most importantly, Roxolana's story demonstrated the power of strategic thinking and long-term planning. in achieving seemingly impossible goals. Her rise wasn't the result of luck or circumstance. It was the product of careful observation, methodical preparation, and brilliant execution of a comprehensive strategy. This lesson had implications far beyond the specific circumstances of her own life. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, ambitious individuals began to study her methods and apply her principles to their own pursuits. The importance of education, the value of building strategic relationships, the necessity of understanding how power actually worked, rather than how it appeared to work. These became recognized principles of advancement within Ottoman society. Her example also highlighted the importance of adaptability and innovation in navigating complex political environments. Roxolana had succeeded not by following established patterns, but by recognizing when those patterns were inadequate and creating new approaches to achieve her objectives. This innovative mindset became part of her legacy, encouraging future generations of Ottoman leaders to question assumptions and explore new possibilities, rather than simply accepting traditional limitations. The military implications of her influence, while less direct than her political and cultural impacts, were nonetheless significant. Her involvement in strategic planning and her insights into international relations contributed to military successes that strengthened the empire's position relative to its rivals. Her understanding of European political dynamics, gained through her diplomatic correspondence and intelligence networks, provided valuable information for military planning. Her ability to assess the strengths and weaknesses of potential enemies and allies helped inform strategic decisions that affected the outcomes of major conflicts. The intelligence networks she had helped establish continued to provide valuable information long after her death. The relationships she had built with informants and allies throughout Europe created sources of information that successive Ottoman leaders could draw upon when planning military campaigns or diplomatic initiatives. Her influence on military policy also extended to questions of resource allocation and strategic priorities. Her understanding of economic factors and their relationship to military capability helped shape decisions about where to focus the empire's military resources for maximum effectiveness. The technological and scientific advances that occurred during her era also benefited from her support and patronage. Her interest in practical applications of knowledge led her to support scholars and inventors whose work contributed to Ottoman technological capabilities. The medical facilities she funded became centers for the development and dissemination of medical knowledge. The scholars who worked in these institutions made advances in surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and public health practices that improved medical care throughout the empire. Her support for architectural projects also encouraged innovation in construction techniques and engineering practices. The buildings constructed under her patronage incorporated new technologies and design principles that influenced subsequent architectural developments throughout the Ottoman territories. The agricultural improvements that occurred during this period also reflected her influence. Her understanding of economic relationships and resource management contributed to policies that encouraged agricultural productivity and food security. The legal and administrative precedents established during Roxolana's era continued to influence Ottoman governance long after her death. The expansion of women's legal rights and administrative roles that had occurred under her influence created a foundation for further developments in subsequent generations. The principle that talent and capability should take precedence over birth and traditional status became more firmly established in Ottoman administrative practice. This meritocratic approach helped ensure that the empire continued to attract and promote capable individuals, regardless of their backgrounds. The diplomatic protocols and procedures that had evolved to accommodate her unique position became standard practices for dealing with other powerful women within the imperial system. Future empresses and princess mothers found themselves operating within frameworks that Roxolana had helped establish. But perhaps the most profound aspect of her legacy was the way she had expanded the very concept of what was possible for women in positions of power. Before Roxolana, female influence in the Ottoman system had been largely indirect and temporary. After her, It became clear that women could wield direct, sustained, and transformative political authority. This shift in understanding had implications that extended far beyond the Ottoman Empire. Her example provided inspiration and practical guidance for women throughout the Islamic world and beyond, who sought to expand their own spheres of influence and authority. The model of female leadership she had created, combining intelligence, strategic thinking, cultural sensitivity, and unwavering determination, became a template that influenced women's approaches to power for centuries to come. Yet for all her achievements and lasting influence, Roxolana remained a figure of profound complexity and contradiction. The same qualities that enabled her remarkable rise also led to actions that cost lives and disrupted established relationships. The strategic brilliance that allowed her to outmaneuver powerful enemies also required a level of ruthlessness that modern observers might find difficult to accept. Her legacy forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about power, ambition, and the prices we're willing to pay for transformative change. She achieved the impossible, but at costs that were both personal and political, both immediate and long-lasting. The empire she helped shape would continue to evolve and adapt long after her death, facing new challenges and opportunities that she could never have anticipated. But the principles she had established, the importance of merit over birth, the value of strategic thinking, the power of education and cultural development, would continue to influence Ottoman approaches to these challenges. Her story reminds us that history's most significant transformations often emerge from the most unlikely sources. The young woman captured and enslaved in a distant province could never have imagined that she would one day reshape the political landscape of one of history's greatest empires. But she possessed qualities, intelligence, determination, adaptability, and vision that enabled her to recognize opportunities others missed and to act on those opportunities with remarkable effectiveness. In the end, Roxolana's legacy isn't just about one woman's extraordinary rise to power, it's about the broader human capacity for transformation, the potential for individuals to transcend the limitations imposed by their circumstances, and the ways in which personal ambition can align with historical necessity to create lasting change. Her story continues to resonate today because it addresses timeless questions about power, identity, and possibility that remain as relevant now as they were in the 16th century. She showed us what can happen when exceptional individuals refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose on them. The slave who became an empress, the outsider who transformed an empire, the woman who rewrote the rules of power itself. Roxolana's story stands as testament to the extraordinary potential that lies within ordinary circumstances, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, preparation, and courage to transform the world. The transformation Roxolana had achieved was extraordinary, but it came with consequences that would echo through Ottoman history for generations. By the time of her death in 1558, she had fundamentally altered not just her own position, but the entire structure of how power operated within the empire. The ripple effects of her innovations would touch every aspect of Ottoman society, from the highest levels of government to the daily lives of ordinary citizens across 3 continents. Her death itself marked a crucial turning point. For decades, she had been the invisible hand guiding imperial policy, the voice that shaped Suleiman's decisions, the strategic mind that had eliminated threats and consolidated power. With her gone, the empire faced a period of adjustment as various factions sought to fill the vacuum her absence had created. Suleiman, now in his 70s, found himself ruling without the partner who had been his closest advisor for nearly 4 decades. The Sultan, who had once been known for his decisive leadership, began to show signs of the isolation that came with absolute power. Without Roxolana's counsel, his decision-making became more erratic, his judgment less sure. The impact was felt immediately in the imperial administration. Officials who had grown accustomed to navigating Roxolana's influence suddenly found themselves operating in an environment where the old certainties no longer applied. Some attempted to maintain the policies and approaches she had favoured, hoping to preserve their positions by demonstrating loyalty to her memory. Others saw her death as an opportunity to reverse changes they had opposed but been powerless to challenge while she lived. The harem itself underwent a particularly dramatic transformation. For decades, it had operated under Roxolana's direct influence, with her allies in key positions and her vision shaping its culture and priorities. Her death created a power vacuum that various factions rushed to fill, leading to internal conflicts that occasionally spilled over into broader court politics. The women who had served under Roxolana found themselves in precarious positions. Those who had been closest to her faced suspicion from rivals who had been waiting for an opportunity to challenge their authority. The educational and cultural programs she had established came under scrutiny from traditionalists who had never been comfortable with the expanded roles women had assumed under her influence. Yet even in death, Roxolana's legacy proved remarkably resilient. The precedents she had established were too firmly entrenched to be easily overturned. The legal status of imperial wives, the involvement of women in diplomatic correspondence, the patronage of architectural and educational projects, all of these innovations had become part of the Ottoman system in ways that survived their creators' passing. Perhaps most importantly, her example continued to inspire women throughout the empire who had witnessed her rise and understood what it meant for their own possibilities. Young women entering the harem brought with them knowledge of what Roxolana had achieved, and they applied the lessons of her success to their own circumstances. Consider the story of Safiye Sultan, who entered the imperial harem just as Roxolana's influence was reaching its peak. As a young woman, Safiye had observed the former slave's methods, studying how she built alliances, eliminated rivals, and positioned herself as an indispensable advisor to the Sultan. When Safiye's own son became Sultan years later, she applied these lessons to establish her own powerful position as Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning monarch. Safiye's success demonstrated that Roxolana's achievements weren't merely the result of unique circumstances or exceptional personal qualities. They represented a new model of female authority that could be learned, adapted, and applied by others who possessed the intelligence and determination to follow her example. The architectural legacy Roxolana left behind also continued to shape Ottoman society long after her death. Her mosque complex in Constantinople became a pilgrimage site for women seeking inspiration and guidance. The hospitals she had built continued to provide medical care, while the schools she had funded educated thousands of children who might otherwise have remained illiterate. But perhaps more significantly, these buildings served as permanent reminders of what a woman could accomplish when given the opportunity and resources to pursue her vision. They challenged assumptions about female capability and authority in ways that no amount of theoretical argument could match. The diplomatic relationships Roxolana had cultivated also proved to have lasting value. The network of contacts she had built throughout Europe continued to provide useful intelligence and diplomatic options for Ottoman leaders dealing with international crises. Her correspondence had established protocols for female involvement in international relations that subsequent generations of Ottoman women would build upon. The economic policies she had influenced created lasting changes in how the empire approached trade and commercial development. The emphasis on supporting local industries, encouraging technological innovation, and maintaining positive relationships with international trading partners became established features of Ottoman economic strategy. These policies contributed to a period of sustained prosperity that helped fund the empire's continued expansion and cultural development. The workshops and manufacturing facilities that had operated under her patronage became models for similar enterprises throughout Ottoman territories. The educational initiatives she had supported also had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond their immediate beneficiaries. The scholars and administrators who had received their training in institutions she had funded went on to serve throughout the empire, carrying with them approaches to learning and governance that reflected her influence. These individuals became agents of change in their own right, applying the principles they had learned to new challenges and opportunities. Their work helped spread innovations in administration, law, medicine, and other fields that strengthened the empire's overall capabilities. The legal precedents established during Roxolana's era also proved to have lasting significance. The expansion of women's rights and opportunities that had occurred under her influence created a foundation for further developments in subsequent generations. While progress was often slow and uneven, the principle that women could play meaningful roles in governance and administration had been firmly established. This shift had practical implications for how the empire utilized its human resources. By recognizing and developing female talent, Ottoman society gained access to capabilities and perspectives that had previously been overlooked or suppressed. The cumulative effect of this change contributed to the empire's continued vitality and adaptability. The military implications of her influence also extended beyond her lifetime. The strategic insights she had provided, the intelligence networks she had helped establish, and the diplomatic relationships she had cultivated continued to benefit Ottoman military planning and operations. The information-gathering systems she had developed proved particularly valuable during conflicts with European powers. The contacts she had made throughout European courts provided ongoing sources of intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Her understanding of economic factors and their relationship to military strength also influenced how the empire allocated resources for defense and expansion. The principles she had helped establish regarding the importance of maintaining strong economic foundations for military operations became standard elements of Ottoman strategic thinking. The cultural impact of her story extended throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Her rise from slavery to supreme authority provided inspiration for women facing their own challenges with limited opportunities and restricted roles. Her example demonstrated that dramatic social advancement was possible for those who combined intelligence with determination and strategic thinking. This message resonated particularly strongly in societies where women faced similar constraints and limitations. Her story became a source of hope and practical guidance for women seeking to expand their own spheres of influence and authority. The religious dimensions of her legacy also had lasting significance. Her successful integration into Ottoman Islamic society, despite her Christian origins, reinforced the empire's appeal to talented individuals from diverse backgrounds. Her visible piety and support for Islamic institutions helped establish models for how converts could demonstrate their commitment to their adopted faith. This example encouraged other converts to pursue advancement within the imperial system, while also reassuring traditional Muslims about the loyalty and dedication of those who had joined their community from other religious backgrounds. The technological and scientific advances that had occurred under her patronage also continued to benefit Ottoman society. The medical knowledge developed in institutions she had funded spread throughout the empire, improving healthcare and extending life expectancy for thousands of people. The architectural innovations pioneered in her building projects influenced construction techniques and design principles that were applied to subsequent projects throughout Ottoman territories. These advances contributed to the empire's reputation for architectural excellence and engineering sophistication. The agricultural improvements that had been implemented during her era also had lasting effects on food security and economic stability. The policies she had helped develop regarding land use, crop selection, and rural development became standard practices that supported population growth and urban expansion. But perhaps the most profound aspect of her legacy was the way she had expanded the very concept of what was possible within the Ottoman system. Before Roxolana, social mobility had been limited by assumptions about the fixed nature of social hierarchies and the permanent character of status distinctions. Her rise demonstrated that these assumptions were not immutable laws, but social constructions that could be challenged and changed by individuals with sufficient capability and determination. This revelation had implications that extended far beyond questions of female authority to encompass broader issues of merit, opportunity, and social justice. The empire that emerged from the Roxolana era was more dynamic, more meritocratic, and more responsive to individual talent regardless of its origins. These qualities contributed to Ottoman resilience and adaptability in the face of changing circumstances and new challenges. The administrative reforms that had been implemented under her influence created more efficient and effective governance structures. The emphasis on education and cultural development that she had promoted strengthened the empire's intellectual foundations. The diplomatic innovations she had pioneered improved the empire's relationships with other powers. All of these changes contributed to a period of continued Ottoman strength and expansion that lasted well into the 17th century. The empire that Roxolana had helped reshape proved capable of adapting to new technologies, new forms of warfare, and new economic realities in ways that demonstrated the lasting value of her contributions. Yet her legacy also included shadows and complexities that remind us of the costs associated with dramatic political transformation, the elimination of rivals, the disruption of traditional relationships, the concentration of power in new hands. All of these changes came with human consequences that were both immediate and long-lasting. The sons who died in succession struggles, the officials who lost their positions and influence, the families who saw their traditional privileges diminished. These individuals paid prices for transformations they had not chosen and might not have supported. These costs raise important questions about the relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare, between innovation and stability, between the pursuit of power and the responsibilities that come with its exercise. Roxolana's story forces us to confront the reality that even positive historical changes often involve tragic elements, that progress frequently comes at prices paid by those who had no voice in determining whether such progress was worth its costs. At the same time, her achievements remind us of the extraordinary potential that can be unleashed when artificial barriers to advancement are removed, when talent is recognized and developed regardless of its origins, when individuals are given opportunities to contribute their full capabilities to collective endeavors. The Ottoman Empire that benefited from her contributions was stronger, more prosperous, and more culturally vibrant than it would have been without her influence. The millions of people who lived under Ottoman rule experienced better governance, expanded opportunities, and greater security because of changes she had helped implement. The educational institutions she had supported educated thousands of children who used their learning to improve their own lives and contribute to their communities. The medical facilities she had funded saved countless lives and reduced suffering throughout the empire. The architectural projects she had commissioned provided spaces for worship, learning, and healing that served their communities for centuries. These concrete benefits must be weighed against the costs and complexities of her rise to power. The full assessment of her legacy requires acknowledging both the remarkable achievements and the troubling methods, both the lasting benefits and the immediate costs. Her story also illuminates broader themes about the nature of historical change and the role of exceptional individuals in shaping the course of events. She was undoubtedly a person of extraordinary capability who made choices that had far-reaching consequences for millions of people. Yet, her success also depended on circumstances beyond her control, on opportunities that arose from the particular configuration of political, social, and economic forces that characterized her era. Her achievements were both the result of her individual qualities and the product of historical conditions that made such achievements possible. This interplay between individual agency and historical circumstance is one of the most fascinating aspects of her story. She succeeded because she possessed remarkable qualities, but also because she lived at a time and in a place where those qualities could be applied effectively to achieve transformative results. The lessons of her experience remain relevant today, not because our circumstances exactly parallel those of the 16th century Ottoman Empire, but because the fundamental challenges of recognizing talent, overcoming artificial barriers, and creating opportunities for advancement continue to shape our own societies. Her example reminds us that dramatic change is possible, that individuals can transcend the limitations imposed by their circumstances, that systems which appear rigid and unchangeable can be transformed by those who understand how they actually work and possess the courage to act on that understanding. The slave who became an empress, the outsider who transformed an empire, the woman who rewrote the rules of power itself, Roxolana's story continues to inspire because it demonstrates the extraordinary potential that lies within ordinary circumstances, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, preparation, and determination to change the world. Her legacy lives on not just in the specific changes she implemented, but in the broader principle she embodied, that human potential should not be constrained by artificial limitations, that talent and capability deserve recognition regardless of their origins, and that individuals who refuse to accept the boundaries others try to impose on them can achieve things that seem impossible to those who accept conventional wisdom about what is possible. As we consider her remarkable journey from captivity to supreme authority, we are reminded that history's most significant transformations often emerge from the most unexpected sources, carried out by individuals who possess the vision to see beyond present circumstances and the determination to act on that vision despite overwhelming obstacles. The woman who changed an empire continues to challenge us to examine our own assumptions about power, possibility, and the untapped potential that exists within every society, waiting for the right circumstances and the right individuals to unlock its transformative power. In understanding the full scope of Roxolana's transformation of the Ottoman Empire, we must examine how her influence extended into the most intimate aspects of imperial governance. After her death, the systems she had created continued to operate, but they began to evolve in ways that revealed both the strength and the fragility of the changes she had implemented. The succession crisis that had consumed the final years of her life ultimately resolved in favor of her son Selim, but his ascension to the throne in 1566 brought with it new challenges that tested every aspect of the political framework she had constructed. Selim II, known to history as Selim the Sot due to his fondness for wine, represented a very different type of leader than his father Suleiman had been. Where Suleiman had been a hands-on ruler who personally led military campaigns and involved himself in the details of administration, Selim preferred to delegate authority while focusing on cultural and artistic pursuits. This shift in leadership style created opportunities for the networks Roxolana had established to demonstrate their resilience and adaptability. The most immediate beneficiary of this new dynamic was Selim's mother-in-law, a woman named Nurbanu Sultan, who had studied Roxolana's methods carefully and applied them to her own rise within the imperial hierarchy. Nurbanu had entered the harem as a young woman during Roxolana's peak years of influence, and she had observed firsthand how the former slave had built her power base. When Selim became sultan, Nurbanu found herself positioned to wield influence through her daughter, who was now the sultan's wife, and through her grandson, who would eventually inherit the throne. But rather than simply copying Roxolana's approach, Nurbanu adapted those methods to the new circumstances she faced. Where Roxolana had worked primarily through direct influence on Suleiman, Nurbanu developed a more complex system that operated through multiple channels simultaneously. She maintained close relationships with key administrative officials, cultivated diplomatic contacts throughout Europe, and established her own network of informants and allies that extended throughout the empire. Her approach reflected lessons learned from watching Roxolana's career. She understood that depending too heavily on influence with a single individual, even the Sultan himself, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by rivals or eliminated by unexpected events. Instead, She built redundant systems that could continue operating even if one source of influence was compromised. The diplomatic correspondence that began during Nurbanu's era reveals the sophistication of this approach. Letters between the Ottoman court and European powers increasingly involved multiple participants, with the Sultan's mother, his wife, and various female relatives all playing roles in international communications. This wasn't simply a matter of ceremonial courtesy. These women were discussing substantive issues of trade policy, military alliances, and territorial disputes. European courts found themselves dealing with a more complex Ottoman decision-making process that required understanding multiple perspectives and interests rather than focusing solely on the Sultan's preferences. The Venetian archives from this period contain detailed reports about Nurbanu's involvement in negotiations over trading rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian ambassadors noted that successful completion of these agreements required securing her support, as well as formal approval from the Sultan and his administrative council. French diplomatic records from the same era describe similar patterns in discussions about military cooperation against Habsburg forces. The French found that their traditional approach of negotiating directly with Ottoman military commanders was insufficient, without also engaging the female power networks that had become integral to imperial decision-making. These developments reflected the institutionalization of changes that had begun under Roxolana's influence. What had started as the exceptional rise of a single remarkable woman had evolved into a new model of governance that incorporated female authority as a standard feature, rather than an extraordinary exception. The architectural projects initiated during this period provide another window into how Roxolana's legacy was being interpreted and extended. Nurbanu commissioned her own mosque complex in Constantinople, but her approach differed significantly from her predecessor's methods. Where Roxolana's architectural patronage had focused on establishing her permanent place in Ottoman history, Nurbanu's projects emphasized practical benefits for the communities they served. Her mosque complex included not just religious facilities, but also extensive commercial spaces, residential areas for scholars and students, and workshops for craftsmen and artisans. This approach reflected a more sophisticated understanding of how architectural patronage could be used to build political support. Rather than simply creating monuments to individual achievement, Nurbanu's projects created economic opportunities and social benefits that generated lasting loyalty among the people who benefited from them. The commercial spaces in her complex became centers of trade and manufacturing that provided employment for hundreds of families. The residential facilities attracted scholars and teachers whose work contributed to Constantinople's reputation as a center of learning. The workshops produced goods that were sold throughout the empire and exported to European markets. These projects generated revenue that funded additional charitable activities and public works. The income from commercial rents supported the maintenance of religious facilities, funded educational programs, and provided assistance to needy families throughout the surrounding neighborhoods. But the economic benefits were only part of the strategy. By creating spaces where people from different backgrounds and social classes interacted on a daily basis, these projects helped build social cohesion and political stability that strengthened the empire as a whole. The workshops brought together craftsmen from various ethnic and religious communities, encouraging the exchange of techniques and ideas that improved the quality of Ottoman manufactured goods. The commercial spaces created opportunities for merchants from different regions to establish business relationships that facilitated trade throughout the empire. The residential facilities for scholars created environments where intellectual development flourished, leading to advances in fields ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and law. The scholars who worked in these institutions became resources for the broader community, providing education and expertise that improved decision-making at all levels of society. These developments demonstrated how the principles Roxolana had established could be adapted and expanded to create lasting benefits that extended far beyond the immediate interests of any individual leader. The focus on education, economic development, and social integration became hallmarks of female patronage throughout the Ottoman Empire. The military implications of these changes were also significant, though they operated in more subtle ways than traditional forms of military influence. The intelligence networks that had been established under Roxolana's guidance continued to provide valuable information about European political developments and military preparations. But under Nurbanu's management, these networks became more sophisticated and comprehensive. Rather than relying primarily on formal diplomatic channels, they incorporated information from merchants, pilgrims, students, and other travelers who moved freely between Ottoman and European territories. The commercial relationships that developed through architectural and economic projects created additional sources of intelligence. Merchants who traded in both Ottoman and European markets provided regular updates about economic conditions, political developments, and military activities that might affect Ottoman interests. The scholarly exchanges that took place in educational institutions funded by female patronage also generated valuable intelligence. European students who came to study in Ottoman institutions and Ottoman scholars who traveled to European universities created informal networks of communication that supplemented official diplomatic channels. This expanded intelligence capability proved particularly valuable during the naval conflicts that dominated Mediterranean politics during the late 16th century. The detailed information available about European naval preparations, ship movements, and strategic planning gave Ottoman commanders significant advantages in planning their own operations. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, despite resulting in Ottoman defeat, demonstrated both the value and the limitations of these intelligence systems. Ottoman commanders had excellent information about the composition and capabilities of the European fleet they faced, but they lacked adequate intelligence about new tactical approaches their enemies had developed. This experience led to innovations in how intelligence was gathered and analyzed. Rather than simply collecting information, Ottoman intelligence networks began to focus more heavily on understanding the implications of the information they gathered and developing strategic responses to emerging threats and opportunities. The educational initiatives that had been established under Roxolana's influence also evolved in response to changing military and political requirements. The curricula in schools funded by female patronage began to include more emphasis on practical subjects like engineering, navigation, and languages that were useful for military and diplomatic purposes. These educational reforms produced a generation of Ottoman administrators and military officers who were better prepared to deal with the technological and strategic challenges facing the empire. They understood European languages and customs, possessed technical skills that were increasingly important for military success, and had been trained to think analytically about complex problems. The legal and administrative systems of the empire also continued to evolve in ways that reflected Roxolana's influence. The precedents established during her era regarding female involvement in legal proceedings and administrative decisions became more formalized and systematic.
Whoa.
Women throughout the empire began to play more active roles in managing family property, resolving business disputes, and participating in community decision-making. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't uniform across all regions and social classes, but they represented a significant shift in how Ottoman society understood women's capabilities and appropriate roles. The court records from this period show increasing numbers of cases where women appeared as independent legal actors, rather than simply as dependents of male relatives. They bought and sold property, entered into business partnerships, and pursued legal remedies for grievances in ways that would have been unusual or impossible in earlier eras. These legal changes had practical economic implications as well. When women could participate more freely in economic activities, families had access to additional sources of income and expertise. The cumulative effect of these changes contributed to increased prosperity and economic dynamization throughout Ottoman territories. The diplomatic protocols that had been established during Roxolana's era also became more systematic and sophisticated. European courts developed standard procedures for communicating with Ottoman women who held positions of authority and these procedures became part of the regular diplomatic process. The correspondence from this period reveals increasingly complex negotiations that involved multiple parties on both sides. European ambassadors found themselves managing relationships with not just the Sultan and his administrative officials, but also with various women who could influence imperial decision-making. This complexity sometimes created challenges for European diplomats who were accustomed to more straightforward hierarchical relationships. But it also created opportunities for more nuanced and flexible diplomatic solutions to difficult problems. The trade agreements negotiated during this period often included provisions that reflected the interests and concerns of female power networks within the Ottoman system. These agreements addressed issues like the protection of merchants' families, the security of commercial facilities, and the resolution of disputes that might arise from cultural misunderstandings. The cultural implications of these changes extended throughout Ottoman society and beyond. The example of women wielding significant political and economic influence encouraged similar developments in other parts of the Islamic world, and even influenced discussions in European courts about the appropriate roles and capabilities of women. The artistic and literary production of this era also reflected these changing social dynamics. Poets and writers began to explore themes related to female authority and capability in ways that would have been unusual in earlier periods. These works helped normalize the idea that women could play meaningful roles in public life and governance. The architectural styles that emerged during this period incorporated design elements that reflected female patronage and influence. Buildings funded by women often included features that served the specific needs of female users, such as separate entrances, private courtyards, and spaces designed for activities traditionally associated with women. But these architectural innovations also challenged traditional gender boundaries by creating spaces where women could engage in activities that had previously been restricted to men. Libraries, workshops, and meeting rooms in buildings funded by female patronage became venues where women could pursue education, conduct business, and participate in community decision-making. The technological innovations that emerged from institutions supported by female patronage also had lasting significance. The emphasis on practical applications of knowledge that characterized these institutions led to developments in fields like textile production, food preservation, and medical treatment that improved living conditions throughout the empire. The textile workshops established under female patronage pioneered new techniques for producing silk and cotton fabrics that became highly prized in European markets. These innovations contributed to Ottoman economic competitiveness and provided employment for thousands of workers throughout the empire. The medical facilities funded by female patronage became centers for the development of new treatments and surgical procedures. The physicians who worked in these institutions made advances in understanding diseases and developing remedies that saved countless lives and reduced suffering throughout Ottoman territories. The agricultural improvements that resulted from female patronage also had significant long-term effects. The emphasis on supporting rural communities and improving farming techniques led to increased food production and better nutrition for millions of people throughout the empire. These practical benefits helped build political support for the expanded roles women were playing in Ottoman society. When people could see concrete improvements in their daily lives that resulted from female leadership and patronage, they were more likely to accept and support continued changes in traditional gender roles. The religious dimensions of these developments also played important roles in legitimizing and sustaining the changes that had begun under Roxolana's influence. The visible piety and charitable activities of women in positions of authority helped reassure traditional Muslims that expanded female roles were compatible with Islamic values and principles. The scholarly work that took place in educational institutions funded by female patronage contributed to theological discussions about the appropriate roles of women in Islamic society. These discussions helped develop religious justifications for the expanded opportunities women were gaining in Ottoman society. The pilgrimage activities supported by female patronage also created opportunities for women from throughout the Islamic world to observe Ottoman innovations and consider how similar changes might be implemented in their own societies. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this continuing evolution was the way it demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the changes Roxolana had initiated. Rather than being dependent on the presence and direct involvement of a single exceptional individual, the systems she had created proved capable of evolving and adapting to new circumstances and challenges. The women who followed her example didn't simply copy her methods, they studied her approaches, understood the principles behind her success, and adapted those principles to their own circumstances and opportunities. This process of learning and adaptation ensured that the changes she had initiated continue to develop and strengthen, rather than simply being preserved as historical artifacts. The networks of relationships and mutual support that developed among women in positions of authority created institutional stability that transcended individual careers and lifespans. When one woman died or lost influence, others were positioned to continue the work and maintain the momentum of change. This institutional continuity proved crucial during periods of political instability and succession crises that might otherwise have reversed the gains women had made. The systems that had been established were robust enough to survive temporary setbacks and continue functioning even when individual leaders faced challenges to their authority. The international recognition of Ottoman women's authority also created external pressures that helped sustain domestic changes. European courts that had developed diplomatic relationships with powerful Ottoman women had interests in maintaining those relationships, even when domestic Ottoman politics created pressures to restrict female influence. The economic benefits that resulted from female leadership and patronage created stakeholder communities that had material interests in preserving and extending women's roles in society. Merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and farmers who had benefited from female-sponsored projects became advocates for continued female involvement in economic and social development. The military and strategic advantages that resulted from female intelligence networks and diplomatic activities created security interests that supported continued female participation in political decision-making. Ottoman military leaders recognized that the information and relationships provided by women in positions of authority contributed to imperial defense and expansion. These multiple sources of support created a foundation for continued evolution that extended far beyond the specific individuals who had initiated the changes. The transformation that had begun with one exceptional woman's rise to power had become embedded in the institutional structure of the empire itself. The legacy that emerged from this process was more durable and comprehensive than what any single individual could have created alone. It represented a fundamental shift in how Ottoman society understood human potential and the relationship between individual capability and social opportunity. The principles that had guided Roxolana's rise, merit over birth, adaptability over tradition, strategic thinking over conventional wisdom, became part of the cultural DNA of the Ottoman Empire. They influenced how the empire approached challenges and opportunities across all areas of government and society. The story of how these principles took root and flourished provides crucial insights into the mechanisms of historical change and the ways in which individual actions can create lasting institutional transformations. It demonstrates that even the most dramatic social changes can become sustainable when they align with broader social needs and create benefits that extend throughout society. The woman who had started as a nameless slave had not just transformed her own circumstances, she had created a new model of human possibility that continued to inspire and guide others long after her own story had ended. The empire that emerged from her influence was more dynamic, more inclusive, and more capable of adapting to changing circumstances than the one she had encountered as a young captive. Her ultimate legacy wasn't just the specific changes she had implemented, but the broader principle she had established, that human potential should not be constrained by arbitrary limitations, that talent deserves recognition regardless of its origins, and that individuals who refuse to accept conventional boundaries can achieve transformations that reshape the world around them. This principle continued to operate throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond, creating opportunities for countless individuals to transcend their circumstances and contribute their capabilities to collective endeavors. The slave who became an empress had not just changed her own fate, she had opened new pathways for human advancement that would benefit generations yet unborn. The transformation Roxolana had achieved extended far beyond the walls of the Ottoman palace, creating ripple effects that would fundamentally alter how power operated throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Her success had proven that the most rigid social hierarchies could be challenged and overcome, but the true test of her legacy would come in how effectively others could learn from her example and adapt her methods to their own circumstances. In the decades following her death, a new generation of women emerged who had grown up witnessing her extraordinary rise. These women understood that Roxolana's success wasn't the result of luck or unique circumstances, but rather the product of systematic strategic thinking that could be studied, understood, and applied to different situations. They began to implement their own versions of her approach, creating a network of female influence that stretched across the empire and beyond. One of the most remarkable examples of this phenomenon occurred in the Crimean Khanate, a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire located on the northern shores of the Black Sea. Here, a woman named Kanake Hatun had observed Roxolana's methods through diplomatic correspondence and court connections. When her own son became Khan of the Crimeans, Kanike applied lessons learned from the Ottoman Empress to establish her own position of authority. But Kanike faced challenges that were quite different from those Roxolana had encountered. The Crimean Khanate was a smaller, more precarious state that depended heavily on military raids and tribute collection for its survival. The traditional power structures here were more fluid than those in the Ottoman heartland, but they were also more dangerous, with rival clans constantly competing for control and external enemies threatening the state's very existence. Kanike's approach reflected these different circumstances. Where Roxolana had worked primarily through cultural patronage and diplomatic influence, Kanike focused more heavily on military intelligence and strategic planning. She established networks of informants throughout the region who provided information about Russian military movements, Polish diplomatic initiatives, and Ottoman policy changes that might affect Crimean interests. Her intelligence operations proved remarkably effective. During a major Russian offensive in the 1570s, Kanike's networks provided early warning that allowed Crimean forces to evacuate vulnerable settlements and reposition their troops for maximum defensive advantage. The resulting military success not only preserved Crimean independence, but also enhanced her son's reputation and, by extension, her own influence within the Khanate. But Kanike understood that military intelligence alone wasn't sufficient to maintain long-term power. Following Roxolana's example, she began to build economic and cultural institutions that would create lasting sources of influence and support. She established trading posts along the major commercial routes that connected the Black Sea region with Ottoman and European markets, creating revenue streams that reduced the Khanate's dependence on military raiding. These commercial enterprises did more than generate income. They created networks of merchants and traders who had material interests in maintaining stable relationships with the Khanate. When rival clans attempted to challenge her son's authority, these commercial allies provided both financial support and valuable intelligence about enemy activities. Kanike also followed Roxolana's example in supporting educational and religious institutions. She funded the construction of madrasas and mosques throughout Crimean territory, but her approach differed significantly from her Ottoman predecessor. Where Roxolana had focused primarily on Islamic institutions, Kaniki recognized the diverse religious composition of the Crimean population and supported educational facilities that served multiple communities. Her madrasas included curricula that addressed the practical needs of a frontier society. Students learned not just traditional Islamic scholarship, but also languages, mathematics, and military engineering that would help them serve effectively in government and military positions. The institutions she funded became training grounds for a new generation of administrators and military officers who were better prepared to deal with the complex challenges facing the Khanate. The religious diversity of her educational support created political advantages that went beyond immediate practical benefits. Christian and Jewish communities within the Khanate recognized that their interests were being considered and protected, reducing internal tensions that might otherwise have been exploited by external enemies. This inclusive approach to institution building reflected a sophisticated understanding of how power worked in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Rather than attempting to impose uniform cultural standards, Kaniki created frameworks that allowed different communities to maintain their identities while contributing to collective security and prosperity. The success of this approach became evident during a major crisis in the 1580s, when a coalition of Russian and Polish forces launched a coordinated offensive designed to eliminate Crimean independence entirely. The diverse communities that had benefited from Kanike's policies rallied to defend the Khanate, providing intelligence, supplies, and military support that proved crucial to the successful defense. The victory wasn't just military, it was political and cultural as well. The effective cooperation between different ethnic and religious groups demonstrated that the inclusive model Kanike had developed could work even under extreme pressure. This success enhanced her reputation throughout the region and provided a template that other leaders would study and adapt. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman heartland, other women were developing their own approaches to building and wielding influence. Safiye Sultan, who had become the mother of the reigning sultan, was implementing strategies that combined elements of Roxolana's methods with innovations suited to the changing circumstances of the late 16th century. Safiye faced challenges that were both similar to and different from those her predecessor had encountered. Like Roxolana, she had to navigate the complex politics of the imperial court while building support for her son and establishing her own authority. But the political environment had changed significantly since Roxolana's era, requiring new approaches to familiar problems. The Ottoman Empire of the 1580s was larger and more complex than the one Roxolana had known. New territories had been added, new administrative challenges had emerged, and new types of threats had appeared on the empire's borders. The traditional methods of imperial governance were struggling to keep pace with these changes, creating opportunities for innovative approaches to emerge. Safiye recognized that the centralized model of female influence that Roxolana had developed might not be sufficient for managing the empire's expanded scope and complexity. Instead of trying to control everything from the imperial capital, she began to develop a more distributed system that operated through regional networks and local allies. Her approach involved identifying capable women in provincial centers and providing them with resources, training, and authority to address local challenges while maintaining coordination with imperial policy. This created a network of female administrators and power brokers who could respond quickly to emerging problems without waiting for instructions from Constantinople. The system proved its value during a series of rebellions that erupted in the empire's eastern provinces during the 1590s. Traditional imperial responses to such rebellions involved dispatching military forces from the capital, a process that was slow, expensive, and often ineffective in addressing the underlying causes of unrest. Safiye's network allowed for more sophisticated and effective responses. Local female administrators who understood regional conditions and grievances were able to identify the root causes of rebellions and develop targeted solutions that addressed specific concerns. In some cases, they prevented rebellions entirely by resolving grievances before they escalated into violence. When military action was necessary, the intelligence and local support provided by these networks made Ottoman operations more effective and less costly. Regional allies provided detailed information about rebel capabilities and intentions, identified potential collaborators and opponents, and helped coordinate military and political responses. The success of this distributed approach to governance created new models that would influence Ottoman administration for generations. The principle that effective imperial control required local knowledge and regional adaptation became embedded in administrative practice, improving the empire's ability to manage its vast and diverse territories. But perhaps more significantly, Safiye's innovations demonstrated that the changes initiated by Roxolana could evolve and adapt to meet new challenges. Rather than being limited to the specific methods their predecessor had used, the women who followed her example were able to develop new approaches that built upon her fundamental insights while addressing different circumstances. This adaptability proved crucial as the Ottoman Empire faced increasingly complex challenges during the transition from the 16th to the 17th century. The empire's traditional advantages in military technology and organization were being eroded by European innovations. New forms of economic competition were emerging as European powers developed alternative trade routes that bypassed Ottoman territories. Religious and cultural changes were creating new sources of internal tension and external conflict. The women who had learned from Roxolana's example proved remarkably effective at developing responses to these challenges. Their networks provided early warning about emerging threats and opportunities. Their understanding of local conditions enabled more effective policy implementation. Their ability to work across traditional boundaries of ethnicity, religion, and social class created new resources for addressing complex problems. Consider the response to the economic challenges created by European exploration of sea routes to Asia. Traditional Ottoman approaches might have focused primarily on military solutions, attempting to disrupt European trade routes or prevent access to Asian markets through force. While military responses remained important, the female networks that had emerged following Roxolana's example also developed economic and diplomatic strategies. They established new trading relationships with Asian merchants who were seeking alternatives to European intermediaries. They developed new products and services that took advantage of Ottoman geographic position and cultural connections. They created diplomatic initiatives that exploited European rivalries and conflicts to Ottoman advantage. These multifaceted responses proved more effective than purely military approaches would have been. They generated revenue that helped fund military operations when necessary, created political relationships that complicated European efforts to build anti-Ottoman coalitions, and demonstrated Ottoman adaptability in ways that enhanced the empire's international reputation. The success of these approaches also had important implications for how the Ottoman Empire understood its own identity and capabilities. The empire had traditionally seen itself primarily as a military power that maintained its position through conquest and intimidation. The innovations developed by women following Roxolana's example demonstrated that Ottoman strength could also be based on economic creativity, diplomatic sophistication, and cultural appeal. This expanded understanding of imperial capabilities influenced how the empire approached new challenges and opportunities. Rather than relying exclusively on military solutions, Ottoman leaders began to develop more comprehensive strategies that incorporated economic, diplomatic, and cultural elements. The architectural projects initiated during this period reflected these changing approaches. Where earlier Ottoman architecture had emphasized the power and grandeur of military conquest, the buildings commissioned by women during the late 16th and early 17th centuries focused more heavily on practical benefits and cultural appeal. The mosque complexes, hospitals, schools, and commercial facilities built during this era were designed not just to demonstrate imperial wealth and power, but also to create economic opportunities, improve living conditions, and strengthen social cohesion. They incorporated architectural elements from various cultural traditions within the empire, creating distinctively Ottoman styles that appealed to diverse populations. These buildings became symbols of a more inclusive and sophisticated approach to imperial governance. They demonstrated that Ottoman rule could provide concrete benefits to subject populations while respecting their cultural identities and religious practices. This approach helped maintain imperial unity even as external pressures increased and internal challenges became more complex. The educational institutions supported by female patronage during this period also reflected evolving approaches to imperial challenges. The curricula in these schools began to include more emphasis on practical skills like engineering, navigation, and medicine that were necessary for maintaining Ottoman competitiveness in a changing world. But the educational innovations went beyond simply adding new subjects to traditional Islamic learning. They involved fundamental changes in how knowledge was understood and transmitted. Students were encouraged to ask questions, conduct experiments, and develop new solutions to practical problems rather than simply memorizing established authorities. This approach to education produced a generation of Ottoman administrators, military officers, and scholars who were better prepared to deal with the complex challenges facing the empire. They understood European languages and customs, possessed technical skills that were increasingly important for military and economic success, and had been trained to think creatively about difficult problems. The diplomatic initiatives developed by women during this period also reflected sophisticated understanding